Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session of Wonk Week. My name is Tyler Durble, and I'm a customer success manager here at Quorum. We're going to give folks a minute or two to join the call, but then we will get started. Thanks so much for joining, Neil. Where are you joining from?
Portland, Oregon.
Oh, lovely. So nice to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Let's see. How was Halloween? Do you have any good, Halloween plans come through?
We were fully active on the block. Lots of candy given away, and I think the kids are still in a coma right now at 8 a.m. Pacific time.
Well, bless you for coming on so early. I think we're going to get started. Once again, my name is Tyler Durble, and we're here to discuss taking your public affairs global. As someone who works with many of Quorum's clients who work in global government affairs, I'm really excited to be able to share some important strategies with you all today. But before we dive in, I want to share just a few housekeeping items. First off, the session is going to be recorded, and the recording, as well as the slides that we're going over, will be distributed after the event. Second, you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen a chat box and a Q&A submission form. We encourage you all to use that chat throughout the session to share insights and submit your questions to the Q&A as you think of them during the presentation. Then we'll go through some of the questions at the end. But with that, I think we're ready to dive into the content. I'm really excited to be joined here today by Neil Simon, Executive Vice President of Resolute Public Affairs. From civic challenges to cybersecurity crises, Neil works with clients to create and run communications and public affairs campaigns that build connection, drive conversation, and win results. And with that, Neil, I'll pass it over to you.
Hey, thanks a lot, Tyler. Happy to be here. Let's make sure that my screen share works okay. I'm going to pull up some slides for everybody. Boom, boom. Are you seeing my PowerPoint?
Let me see. Not seeing anything from our side.
Nope.
Here we go.
You see it?
Yep.
Okay, I'll go full screen. So yeah, thanks a lot, Tyler, joining you from Portland, Oregon today, but got a lot of different global connections to bring to the group that's on the call. Looking forward to everyone's questions. I'm going to talk through some of my learnings from my time both in Washington and in Copenhagen and in Brussels. I worked for the European Union for 5 years on their US outreach strategy, and I was based in Copenhagen for about 3 years as the communications director for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and the Parliamentary Assembly, which worked with 57 different countries' national parliaments at the time. So got some insights about the differences between Central Asian parliaments and Western European, and of course, our old friends in North America. Before my political work and government work, I was actually a journalist for on and off for about 10 years in Washington and in local markets before then. So I also bring a love of storytelling into what we do here in the public affairs realm, with this romantic notion that if we can tell good stories, whether we're journalists or not, we can inspire people to be politically active. So I think that we have a lot to talk about here. You mentioned what we do at Resolute. We've got a team in Washington, D.C., a team in Chicago, a team in South Carolina, myself out in the West. And we work with organizations of all stripes to help them advance their agendas, nonprofits, community organizations, some government agencies. And we're really proud of what we're able to do to move things forward on national conversations and drive campaigns that drive positive change for our world. When you're taking your government affairs strategy global, the biggest question that I think anyone needs to answer is, who are you really trying to take it to? You don't wake up one day and say, oh, well, we've been doing pretty well in the US. Let's take it, to the world. You pick countries, just like in the US, you might pick states. And so of all of the countries out there in the world, there's a prioritization that we need to do. And when we're doing that, we got to start, just as I think we do domestically, with our message. How are we going to define that singular focus that we're going to be able to break apart into multiple contexts? So you got different cultural contexts, different geographic contexts, but you still have that singular focus of what you want to do. So today what I'll do is showcase some Oregon wine for you from here in the Willamette Valley as a potential backbone that we could keep coming back to and through the conversation. And let's say the goal for your international wine distributorship that's based in the US is you want to have market access. You want to preserve market access for your product, in this case, wine. And you want to minimize your regulatory risk to global operations. Wait, what's that seal that just popped up? This is the European Union's Geographical Indicators seal. Out in Willamette Valley, just like in the Napa Valley in California, these are protected place names. You can't just grow wine and say, yes, this is an Oregon Pinot from the Willamette Valley. That's a protected place name because of the geographic space where that wine is grown. Just like you might have technology hurdles where you want to protect your own patents, agriculture hurdles as well. So if you're going to be selling in the EU, you might want to have that label. So when you're making your priority list, where do you start? I always suggest you start with where you already are. Your most loyal customers, if you will, your most loyal champions in legislatures, if you will, that's your existing states. That's where you're already solid. So you want to grow them and nurture them, of course. And then you might have some growth states. Maybe you want to get that wine into Eastern Europe more. Maybe you've been doing some pretty good job in other countries, but you've got a few that you're like, you know what? These are the places that we're going to grow next. But then you might have some states of influence. Maybe the cap, maybe the steel that is used for your cap on your wine, or maybe the cork that you're using is from a certain country. Now your supply chain factors in. So these I consider to be states of influence. They may not be nations that you're necessarily selling to, but they're places that they can gum up the works. And so you got to pay attention to those. For a lot of folks in their supply chain, they learned the hard way during the pandemic. They had too much invested in their supply chain in China. And when things went down in China and plants were not operational, that's when all of a sudden you saw diversification within supply chains. So you got to think about all three of these circles in the Venn diagram and choose where you're going to really dedicate those resources. Once you've done so, this is the spectrum that we use when we're advising clients. There might be some places that you're really going to be on the low end of the spectrum. I just keep some monitoring, check the news, make sure you're getting some regular updates on that least engagement side. On the far right side, with the most engagement, you might actually have an office there. You might actually put people on the ground to be working intimately with that legislative body. And then, of course, in the middle, you've got anything from periodic visits to build some relationships. Maybe you're going to go out to the country quarterly, build some brand awareness, hold a couple events, or maybe you're going to hire a consultant that's with you part-time in the country and also do some frequent visitation. Whatever that spectrum is, obviously your highest priority markets are going to be furthest to the right on that spectrum of most engagement. But how you engage matters. And for that, I had a lesson the other day. I was meeting with a friend who does emergency response work for the US Coast Guard. And after the fires in Maui, the Coast Guard was activated to work on strengthening and rebuilding and recovery of the area around Lahaina and in Maui that was burned by the fires. So you had historic ocean frontage, you had some marinas, but you had a major cultural context with the Native Hawaiian population. And not all of the various people in Hawaii share that same cultural context, depending on the island they're from. So when my friend got on the ground in Hawaii, the first thing he did was hire someone to bring into meetings. And he told this person, your job is to raise every cultural red flag before we've made any decisions. That meant making sure that the areas they were talking about, they were using the proper vocabulary. That make sure that historical context came into the perspective of conversations about how they were treating the land before they were talking about rebuilding. These things in the moment of an emergency were extremely important to him. And he knew, as someone coming over from the mainland, he just didn't have that context and he needed someone who did know it. And so this person he brought in ended up helping shape those conversations in a way that if he had not done, you could imagine the undoing that would have to be done after decisions were being made. So it's the same thing if you've got different political contexts that you're working with, of course, diverse audiences and unique stakeholders you're talking to. If you don't know that cultural context, you're going to be missing too much that you're going to have to correct after the fact. So I say start there, understanding those cultural differences. And part of that is understanding the media and knowing if that main, mass media element that you're going to use for your campaigns in the US, we know people are using mass media in a different way. Seeing all these countries across the top of this chart from Reuters Foundation show massive decrease in the use of mainstream media as primary sources of news. But look at what's happening in Northern Europe. Pretty much a stable baseline. So if I'm going to do a campaign in Finland, for example, I'm definitely going to feel more confident in going mainstream media than perhaps I am in Spain or Argentina. Also consider staff and elected officials. In the US, the last speaker that I was listening in on for a moment about different strategies with state and local governments, we know if you're with the elected official, that's great. But we also know staff have a ton of power. And so taking advantage of that recess time he was mentioning was a useful time to be in the halls of Congress still. That's not the same in every country, though. Civil society, how is the fabric of civil society strong enough that they could be leveraged as partners for a different cause that you're advancing? What's the strength of political parties? What's the diversification of political parties? We'll talk about that in detail in a second. Something that's very much overlooked by a lot of different government affairs teams. What's the regulatory environment? We'll talk about that as well, because not only is that an opportunity for business and making sure that you're advocating for your clients or yourselves in the regulatory space, but also how you're regulated as someone who may be doing lobbying. And then, of course, the media environment we talked about a moment ago definitely changes the dynamic. Reuters Foundation shows, some countries with really much higher media trust and media that's independent and free from political influence, but also countries where it's much lower. And you might want to second guess the types of media they're using, because you may know just by showing up in that space, you could be seen as having been influenced by a government entity or influenced by a large corporation with a negative reputation. So whatever it may be, bear in mind these cultural contexts before you jump into the waters. The OECD has some great reports on the state of lobbying around the world in the most developed countries that are monitored by the members of the OECD out of Paris. And this gives you a good snapshot of the fact that lobbying transparency is a baseline in a majority of the developed countries. So if you're a consultant lobbyist and you're working with a third-party client, you're going to have to disclose that for sure in at least 52% of the countries of the OECD. If you're an in-house lobbyist, it's a little less, but you see the numbers here. And some people think, well, if I'm not lobbying at the national level, I'm not going to the parliament, I'm not going to a ministry, I want to just go talk to a city or the equivalent of a county, a province, about a mine or some new technology or a new agricultural project. Oh, I'm okay because I'm at that subnational level. Not so much. Here's a map from OECD showing where at the state level you're still going to have some transparency in lobbying requirements. There we are in the USA in the dark green on the far right in the wheel, with some of our peers from Canada and Australia, where each state has its own requirements, usually written into law. In the light green, you see a national framework that mentions or covers the local governments, and then the national framework that leaves it alone in the blue. So you're going to have to do some more research to make sure that you're being on the straight and narrow when you're entering to a country, even at the subnational level. A good chunk, almost half the countries there in purple, do not have state or local regulations governing the lobbying work. But again, still good to check in with someone locally to make sure that you've run those traps. So when we're prioritizing which countries we work in, one of the big questions a lot of people have is they make assumptions that the country that they're looking to do trade with, or the country that they're looking to have some influence in, is the primary place that they should start. And especially when it comes to the European Union, that can be a big mistake, because big policy issues, including food and wine and agriculture, like we just talked about, have jurisdiction at Brussels, at the European level. Privacy policy, obviously, the EU's the GDPR has been seen as the baseline, a global baseline, really. And you're not going to go talk to Germany about data privacy or digital trade. Your trade conversations, your privacy conversations, a lot of your agricultural trade conversations, those are all going to take place in Brussels. And as a prime example, just the other day, pulling out my USB-C charger here, Apple recently ceded to the EU that the EU decided that by next year, all mobile devices are going to have a USB-C charger. Apple for years has had its different chargers for its iPhones. The new iPhone 15 apparently will have the USB-C, or does have the USB-C. That was a nod to the fact that the EU was setting a policy, and rather than continue to try to negotiate and get their way in Europe, a major market, of course, for Apple, they said, all right, we're going to go along and come into the fold of what the EU is demanding for all devices to have uniform charging capabilities by 2025. So this stuff matters. It matters to us. It changes how we use our mobile phones. It changes the types of devices we use. It changes how our food is traded amongst countries. But it doesn't always mean just because we're eating French cheese, we need to talk about policies from the French. We are talking about policies from the European Union as a bloc. I know there was another session during Wonk Week here about stakeholder mapping, so I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think it goes along with the same sense of however you're thinking about your state and local champions here domestically, that mapping out your stakeholders in the countries that you're looking to work in is essential to building that roadmap for how you're going to influence the policies in that country. And when we're doing that at Resolute, what we try to do is build on the strength of triangles. Strongest structure in the world. We think that if you're going to have a government affairs strategy, but you're excluding your public affairs or your media, then you're missing these opportunities to strengthen your government relations tactics. Just the other day, we had a client who was really having a tough time meeting with a federal executive branch decision maker. And we've been working on securing some meetings and trying to get their conversation moving forward. And at the same time, we were working on some media angles. And in late August, we had a fantastic story appear in the Washington Post, actually, that mentioned our client in a positive light and framed the story in the way that we've been trying to do so in small conversation meetings. And it did it so well that we really used that media piece. And that same week that it came out, lo and behold, that executive branch agency contact called us up and said, hey, we're trying to get in touch with so-and-so that you've been working with. Could we have a meeting to talk about this article we saw? It sounds like there's some interesting things afoot. So that media just gives so much credibility. It catapults your credibility, weeks ahead of the timeline that you could otherwise be spending time doing, your phone calls and your emails, and you're sending out, one-pagers. But having that third-party validation from a bona fide media source can just accelerate those conversations. So I mentioned political parties. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think it's a really important thing because so many people, when they first start out in a global governmental operation, they forget the different dynamics of political parties. In the US, I think it would be kind of strange to go to, straight to the Democratic Party or Republican Party with your policy proposals or different things that you're working on, unless you want to influence like the platform language or something like that. It's very strange, though, to see government affairs spend too much time at the parties themselves. Campaigns, candidates, for sure, but straight at the parties, those conversations, I think, when I'm looking at my time in Congress, it's very, very rare that I've seen those efforts really be the place that we spend a ton of time. But we're also a real anomaly in the United States with the number of parties we have. Being a two-party system is actually rare across the developing world. And so if we look at the countries and the blocs like the European Union where you might be interested in being more involved, you look at these high numbers of political parties, coalitions amongst 3, 4, 5 parties at a time to come up with governments in places like in Belgium, especially, constantly having a tough time forming governments with so many political parties. South Africa and Brazil also have high numbers of parties. And so when you think about how you're going to engage, these parties have great influence, and especially at the EU level, having a meeting with a political party group like their version of the Conservative Party, the EPP, you meet with the EPP party group anywhere, and you're going to have a chance to influence legislation in many of the countries where they have majorities in parliament. So we'll talk about that in a case study here coming up. But before we do, I want to do one more note on media and overlooked audiences. Whether it's influencers or social media, I think it's extremely important that when you're thinking about a country that you're doing work in, that you think about what are the channels that people are using. Facebook is still strong in North America, but Telegram is super strong in Africa. Twitter, still strong in Africa. Now X, of course. WhatsApp, super strong in Latin America and Africa. So if I'm trying to get my message to someone in one of those continents, depending on the country, I might be using a channel that I've never used before. So you think about this in whichever countries you're working. I did some marketing in Asia. In every country in Asia that I worked, I was having different spend on different social media channels because I knew that spending on one was going to do me no good in the other. So always a question of finite resources. So use those dollars wisely and spend it in the places where the eyeballs are, of course. So now, as I try to wrap up the conversation, I want to leave you with a case study on something that I'm particularly proud of. And it's work that I did on the Global Magnitsky Act, a human rights act that began as justice for Sergei Magnitsky in the United States. And I came to this topic as a staffer, the communications director for the United States Helsinki Commission, working under Senator Cardin and Senator Wicker at the time in a bipartisan fashion. And Bill Browder was this wealthy businessman who came to Washington to tell his story from London about the trouble he was having with Russia at that time, having arrested his tax attorney. Browder had made a ton of money during the opening of free markets in Russia as the Soviet Union fell. And the truth was, the Kremlin had seen him as becoming too wealthy and not giving enough back to the Kremlin in the ways that they demand. And so they launched an investigation and raided his office and turned over all the computers and everything and fabricated a theft of massive proportion and blamed his tax attorney for a crime that essentially the government had committed against him. And so the theft against Browder becomes the crime that they pin on his attorney, and they put him in prison. And in 2009, this month, so 15 years ago this month, Sergei Magnitsky died in prison. Before he had died, Bill Browder comes to Washington and he delivers an impassioned speech at a hearing that we hold that just reads like a Hollywood movie script for the misdeeds of Putin's Russia, the extreme corruption, and of course, the ending violence, which at the time was only violence and abuse. It was not yet a death. Bill makes it his life's cause to advance this work. We passed the Magnitsky Act. We bar human rights offenders from Russia from entering the U.S., banking in the U.S., sending their kids to colleges in the U.S., vacationing in the U.S., all of these Western extravagances that we know Putin's henchmen want and desire to use with their ill-gotten, money. We know the one thing we can do is prevent them from using that and having access to these Western institutions. We pass this in the U.S. We persuade, at the time, Hillary Clinton's State Department and a reluctant Obama administration to come along, but they do. And since then, Senator Cardin expands the legislation to not just be against the Russian human rights offenders who committed this atrocity against Sergei, but a global act for anyone who commits such human rights atrocities in their country, they can never have the benefit of accessing our Western institutions. And we used the Iran sanctions actually as the initial piece of legislation with Senator McCain's office and others to work on what the actual text should be. But then what happens is Bill uses an aggressive storytelling technique. He makes a documentary film. His books start coming out. He's working the circuit with the political parties in Europe, and he has these building blocks of what the legislation can be. And he makes it simple for anybody to take that model bill and go right back to their national parliament and turn it into law. And so not overlooking political parties, showing up where they are at these conferences, and of course going back to their capitals, he ends up with more than 10 countries and the EU itself adopting model legislation basically built off of what he was able to do with us in the United States. So it's a great model of using storytelling, catering to the cultural context, not overlooking political parties, and remaining engaged on once you've had some success, using that as a model for other places so you don't need to recreate the wheel so often. So I'll leave it there. Happy to answer any questions. I know Quorum has some great tools to help you when you're doing your international monitoring in different countries. We have been active in Latin America, Asia, and the European Union, and the post-Soviet space over the years. Us at Resolute, we have a great joy in helping people build these connections across the globe, and happy to be a help and answer any questions I can for you. I think I'll stop sharing my screen as well.
Thank you, Neil. Really appreciate your insights there. A friendly reminder to everyone, please put some questions into that Q&A section so that we can go through those with Neil. In the meantime, now that we've heard some of those best practices for moving the needle at a global level, I want to zoom down on some of the tactics to track what is moving and where. So I'll get started sharing my screen. But again, in the meantime, please put some questions into that Q&A section here so we can have those for Neil. Okay, fantastic. So we all know how hard it can be to, follow the action across 50 states. It can be even more complex when looking at countries with different legislative processes. If you're looking for a tool to help execute the strategy that I'm about to cover, please reach out to us to learn more about Quorum International. We've recently added legislative tracking for several countries, and that list is only continuing to grow. So let's dive in here. So again, much like state tracking, the key to global tracking is your mechanisms for information gathering and your strategies for organizing your team. And similar to tracking 50 states, it can be hard and also sometimes not necessary to engage with all states or regions equally. These slides today will walk through the key 3 steps you need in your global tracking and building your prioritization strategy. First, we'll talk through your strategies for countries that fall into our kind of sky high category. The lower priority regions where you'll have systems of alert for key movements, but you're mostly being reactive in these areas. Then we'll talk through your ground level coverage, countries where you're engaging proactively. And finally, we'll discuss an issue management strategy for collaboration across your team. So let's talk about this sky high view where, these are places where you need to know what's going on, but the impacts to your business aren't significant enough that you need to build out a full team maybe. So a region might fall into this sky high view category if maybe the policy moves very slowly. So you have time to build up resources or a team if something seems detrimental to your business or there's a piece of policy that you need to take action on. Maybe this is a region where there's a low overall ROI in terms of, the financial impact of changing laws in that country. So maybe, again, it's not, worth it to commit significant resource to their full time. Also, maybe this is a spot where the country is too large for you to make a real impact without a really massive team, but you still need to, keep an eye on what's happening in that region. In this reactive monitoring situation, you'll want a system that sends alerts for mentions of bills on your key and high priority issues, or maybe mentions of your organizations on social media by key officials. So you want to set, these alerts to be on maybe a weekly digest. So it's not taking up too much space in your inbox, but you're still keeping up to date with the goings on in these sort of sky high level regions. Fantastic. Let's take a look at the ground level view now. These are going to be places where it's too risky to be reactive. You want to be shaping the policy conversations and not just following what's happening. For most teams, the US and EU are going to be the kind of core of these ground view tiers, but a region might belong to this ground view tier if maybe you have a key facility or customer base in that region that you really need to manage policy within. Or maybe you have existing relationships with officials, staffers, or other policy influencers. The region could be a key policy leader whose ideas tend to spread to other regions nearby. And maybe this region is relatively small, so it doesn't take a significant amount of time for your team, your organization to make an impact. With this set of regions, you'll want the same tracking system that you're using for that sky high region, but maybe you're getting alerts on a daily basis or immediately when new bills are introduced or there are mentions of your organization in social media. So you'll want to, use a more frequent method of becoming alert, but then also incorporate an email strategy of engagement to reach out to key officials and be proactive in these spaces. No tracking system can fully replace the work of your team, but the right system can really supercharge them in their efforts. So for a global team, a strong issues management setup is very critical for success. For those who may not be familiar, Issues Manager is this folder-like system in Quorum that allows you to save all of your information on an issue in one place. So this could hold, lists of stakeholders, notes, interactions, key bills, and dialogue all around one particular policy issue or initiative for your team. And a key benefit for a global team using the system is information sharing. If a team member in country A is facing an issue that your lobbyist in country B faced last month or last year, there's no need to reinvent the wheel on how to, approach this challenge. With that information being saved and categorized through that issues management system, you can quickly find key talking points and strategies that have been working for that issue, as well as historical information about maybe some events that have been occurring in their own region around that issue. So if you're interested to, take a look at Quorum International, which can support these strategies in dozens of countries, please reach out to us after the session or visit quorum.us. That's all I had here. I'll stop sharing my screen, but I definitely want to be sure that we have time to continue with some Q&A here. All right, let me jump to the Q&A right now. One moment. Cool. So we have an anonymous question, Neil. Are there other places outside the U.S. where you think grassroots advocacy might be effective? Are you seeing any trends in grassroots advocacy from your work?
I think for sure, grassroots advocacy is classic in even places where there's not democracy. I did a conversation in I'll just say an Asian country on behalf of USAID. And I remember the differences in these thoughts of, I was working with a bunch of national members of a foreign affairs committee of their national assembly, the parliament. And they have a desire to have the people, the people's support, even if they don't need the people's votes for their seats. And so if there's a mass movement on the streets, that's painful for any official in any government entity. It's painful for leadership, and it makes them second guess what they're doing. And sustained over time, it definitely makes them consider making a significant change. In democracies, I think that it's even more pronounced. But my point is, it's not just the democracies where it matters. It's harder to orchestrate in non-democratic countries. But I can't think of a place where you don't want that to be a part of the conversation. That's why when we build that triangle with our strategy for folks, like, okay, who's the public? Who's civil society? Who are the players who are going to activate that grassroots movement for your cause, who are going to care? And then how's the media going to, feed off of that? And how's that all going to amplify so that your government sector players are going to hear that message, be more receptive to it because they're seeing it on the ground from the grassroots, and you're going to amplify it with your grass tops. And so I think that there's not a strategy I can ever imagine, and that's obviously with my great Western bias, where we would not want to include elements of grassroots movement within our work. So we've seen it. We're doing a project promoting media freedom in Poland. In the Law and Justice Party in Poland for the last several years has really taken a hard right turn, clamping down on media freedoms and judicial separations and other concerns that human rights activists and the EU, frankly, itself has had with the direction that Poland was moving. We built up a campaign to show the U.S. support for independent and free media, engage the Polish diaspora, and these things have an effect. They start to hear and listen to, gosh, our international reputation is affected by what's happening here. In the end, they lost an election. So I think that you can't ignore the power of grassroots.
Thank you, Neil. Appreciate that. Taking a step back, perhaps the question I should have asked first from the group here, for a team that's just starting out in international policy, what's the first thing you do to get started?
I would start with that Venn diagram. My first job in TV news, I remember having research meetings like, who's watching our newscast right now? How can we get them to watch a little bit more? Who's buying your candy bar right now? How can we get those to buy a little bit more? Who likes us right now? How can we get them to like us a little bit more? That's your base. And if your base is trickling away, you've got other issues. But if you can build up that base, so I call that existing states in that first circle. And I would start there. It's like, where do we need to be sort of shoring up those friendships? Where do we need to strengthen those champions? And then the next circle I look at is that one that was on the bottom left, where we look at growth states. Okay, but where are the places that we're more likely to grow? These are the softer targets. If we're in a political campaign mode, these are the persuadables, right? And so we want to then look at that circle and think, okay, what could be, if there's 10 countries in there, what are the 2 that we think we have the best shot at growing in next year? Let's invest our time there. And that could be based on different market forces. It could be based on different political dynamics. Maybe there's an election coming up, so there's a moment to seize upon where, hey, change is in the air in that country. Let's be there. Let's be part of that change. Or it could be, hey, that country's national parliament really is taking showing that their priority work is really in the issue area, that they don't even realize we're a national leader in a different country. Let's be there because that'll help us. That's a growth strategy. So those are definitions I use to think about who is a growth state. Well, it's people are going to buy your stuff more. They're going to care about you more, or they're in a moment of change where you have an entry point. And then that third bucket, I think, is those, what are the those states that could pose a challenge to you? It could be your supply chain, or it could be a regulatory environment that's a really concern. And so on the flip side, you might want to be engaged there as a priority, because if a country has an outsized degree of pull and influence over the sector that you operate in, then okay, maybe we need to gather some friends up and play some defense over in country X. So that's how I think of it. Where are we good? Where are we probably going to grow? And where do we got to look out? And based on that, you're probably going to have a short list pretty quick of, a handful of countries where even then you're going to have to say, okay, we can only really be active in 2 or 3 of these.
Really appreciate that, Neil. Another question. This one's coming from Amanda Dietlin. She says, as someone who's done shaping operations and public affairs at the state and federal level, what are some best practices to communicate this experience when trying to enter the international lobbying market?
I'm trying to decipher that question a little bit. It's like, is it a question of
how do you leverage your experience on the state and federal level when moving to the international market, is my understanding of the question.
Yeah, I think that you use what has worked, but then you layer on top of that the cultural context. So you don't want to be so smug that you're like, we did this in the US, it was great. We did this in Louisiana and Montana, and it was great. Now why isn't it working in Paris and in Barcelona? Well, different cultural contexts. So have you spent some time researching Barcelona and, wherever? So I think, to me, that's the biggest, that's the easiest thing to do, is to say, well, we did something well, it was received well, and therefore it should work over here. And you should start with that, because you don't want to discredit yourself. Like, if it did work, like, yeah, hold on to that. That's what they did with Magnitsky. But then what's the cultural context? What's going to be different to make that stick where you are? Who is going to be your champion in that new market? Just because you were successful, you were probably successful at a state or local because you had a champion that carried your cause with you inside the halls of power. If you're working in a different country, you need to find that champion. And that's going to go back to, well, what resources are you going to put on the ground? What relationships are you going to develop? Doing your research to know who those people even are. I think that's the biggest common denominator is people, and the biggest differentiator, people. People are different, and so you've got that same model though that because it worked well for you before. Now you've got to just make sure, like, well, what are the different cultural contexts so that it can work well in these other places?
Yeah, I really like what you said. Kind of not being the stereotypical ugly American. When you come into this space. So definitely really really fantastic there. A question I have for you, Neil, coming from the partners, the Quorum partners that I work with. One of the challenges they have is, how do you report success? When you're looking, maybe across regions or with different regions. What are the ways that you tell the story of how things went or how you reacted to a situation?
Yeah, I think I've been in positions enough where the metrics matter that I'm pretty keen on this, whether it's for a client or for ourselves, or when I've been in the public sector, so I can report out to the public. And I think that depends on your organization. I mean, there's some common ones that I think matter. Meetings matter. I mean, in the government affairs space, sometimes the problem is that people think they got the meeting and therefore they're done. Like, good job, we got the boss in the room. Phew, pack our bags, go back home, we're done. That's obviously a mistake, but it still matters. Those meetings still matter. That's where those relationships are going to go from, maybe a cocktail at a diplomatic reception to a substantive, hey, they really understand our position on this issue. So I think tracking staff and elected meetings held, tracking number of partners that you identify as sort of like-mindeds, because that ends up being the core of building up a team that can be supportive. And whether you're going to form an association in a country or whether you're just going to work in parallel or in tandem with some folks who might otherwise be competitors but have a common cause for you. So I think that those types of things, in the end, government work is relationship work. It's people work. And so what we do is identify in these different concentric circles and different stakeholder maps, who are those people that you need to build influence with, that you need to keep in check if they're a clear opponent. And the actions that you're taking to connect with them, you've got to be recording those, because that's what you got to be reporting back up to your bosses, right? We identified these threats, and here's what we're doing to keep them in check. We identified these opportunities, and these are the things that we're doing to strengthen those and turn them into wins. And usually that is some factor of building relationship through meetings, events held together, coalitions formed. And then, of course, there's activities that support those things too. We published an op-ed. We held an event. You're doing some sort of content strategy around that work. And that gives you some good metrics too, because you could say, hey, we've got X thousand subscribers to our government affairs newsletter in North America. We started doing more work in Brussels. And as we did this newsletter, and this newsletter attracted us X thousand people in Brussels. And now we're building up a coalition that could be a grassroots voice. It can be an awareness, understanding voice. But you're starting to show to people back, at your headquarters, who probably know the US stuff a little bit, hey, this is how it's working in other countries.
I think you've kind of, really touched on something that I find very interesting. Is it's a combination of metrics and storytelling. You did a really great job of walking through the story of, your previous success, and, for folks who are in this international market, finding the ways to show those metrics, the meetings you're having, those connections, and then pair that with that good storytelling. It sounds like that's really a great strategy here. I think we're coming to the end of some of our questions. Any other final thoughts for us, Neil, here?
I'll share just on that last point a little bit about what we see with, and we've got a client that's based in Europe that does a lot of work in the United States and in the tech space. And they've got government affairs teams operating all over the world. And the challenge is we become siloed, right? We think Congress is the only place sometimes. And it's an extremely important place, the US Congress is. And so how do you make sure that the rest of your government affairs team or your company, if you don't have GR in those other countries, how they're aware of things that are happening in different capitals? And so something I did not talk about yet, but I think is worth mentioning here, is internal communications matters too. And it's not just reporting up so people know like the metrics of some of those meetings you're having and some of that content you're creating, but it's just some general awareness of, hey, this is what our team is doing in these countries right now, or these are the things that are happening in government in these countries right now that we don't have resources to touch. So it's almost raising that flag to say, hey, we know we've got 10 people in Washington, we got 0 in Beijing, we got 0 in Brussels, whatever it may be, and look at all these headlines coming out of Beijing and Brussels, and what are we going to do about them? And you can only do so much from so far away. And so I think at least being that internal voice of government matters, these things are happening. If you're on a smaller side of a fast-growing sector, those are things that are really valuable. This client that I had in mind I was describing, they had the resources. They've got people in those places, but they still have the silo problem. And that's where that internal comms can be really helpful.
Fantastic. I'm seeing a question about Quorum International, does include the MENA and Africa region more generally. I apologize, I don't have that answer off the top of my head, but please, the person who asked that, definitely reach out to us. We'll get that conversation started. But we are approaching the end of our time, so do want to give folks one last opportunity. Please put in a Q&A question. But when we get to the end of our time, we will have the next session coming up at noon, which is how to get noticed at work, professional development discussion with lobbyist and career coach Cicely Simpson. To join, you can sit tight on this page. That'll start around noon. But any last minute questions or any last minute thoughts for us, Neil?
Well, Tyler, if there's no other questions, I'll just share, the thing that stands out to me in all of our work is government work is people work, and people work is relationship work. And all of this comes down to understanding the cultural context with which we're doing the work of our organizations. And at our best, we are going to bring people together. And at our best for our organizations, we're going to bring people together for things that matter to the teams that we work with. So keep in mind, how can you build the best connection? And usually that starts with understanding the culture that you're in. And sometimes that means sharing a meal, and sometimes that means preparing the same briefing that you might have used in a different country, but just a slightly different way, or emphasizing a slightly different story that's going to land that much better in the country that you're in the next day. So good luck on your international government affairs work. If we at Resolute can be of any assistance, I'll put my email in the chat. Tyler, you're awesome. You guys at Quorum are great. And I know that everybody using your tools and building those relationships are going to be able to, do the good things that they can do in new countries.
Thank you so much, Neil. And I think with that last word, I think we'll call it here for today. So again, thank you everyone so much for your time. Again, coming up at noon is how to get noticed at work with Cicely Simpson. Thank you again, Neil, for your time. Have a great rest of your day.